this on right? Hello? Can you hear me? Since it's being recorded, I figured I might as well put the microphone on. All right, hello? You got that? Okay, excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for that warm introduction and for inviting me here to the University of Florida. It's my first time in Gainesville and had a chance to look around the campus. It was lovely. All right, so we'll just go ahead and jump right in. In July 2015, during the launch of his presidential campaign, Donald Trump articulated what has become a hallmark of not only his presidential campaign, but his presidency. He stated, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. And they're bringing those problems with them. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people." Almost a year later, in June 2016, following the shooting at Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, he made a similar speech, this time focused on Muslim immigrants. "We cannot continue to allow thousands upon thousands of people to pour into our country, many of whom have had the same thought process as this savage killer. Many of the principles of radical Islam are incompatible with Western values and institutions. Radical Islam is anti-woman, anti-gay, and anti-American. Ask yourself who's really the friend of women and the LGBTQ community. Clinton wants to allow radical Islamic terrorists to pour into our country. They enslave women and murder gays." This invoking of women's rights and LGBTQ rights stands in juxtaposition to an administration whose policies have deliberately dismantled both domestic and foreign policies and initiatives aimed at protecting those rights. Just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women, which is charged with implementing the Violence Against Women's Act, substantially narrowed the definition of domestic violence and sexual violence to emphasize narrow criminal standards focused on physical harm and that ignore patterns of deliberate and coercive behavior in the form of emotional, economic, or psychological abuse. This administration has also systematically removed LGBTQ protections in almost every area of policy implementation: housing, health, education, and gender violence. This pattern of using gender equality and LGBTQ rights as a strategy to justify restrictive and oppressive immigration agendas, while also advocating the weakening of gender equality policy, is one also used by the European far-right nationalist parties. Throughout Europe, and now in the United States, these rights are articulated as a means of garnering more mainstream legitimacy for the xenophobic policy agenda of the far right. Contemporary leaders such as Marine Le Pen of the National Front and Geert Boulder of the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands have achieved unprecedented electoral success, in part due to their deployment of gender equality rhetoric. In his manifesto, founding the Netherlands Party for Freedom, Geert Wilders stated, "Anyone who thinks that Islam is just one issue cannot count. Mass immigration has huge implications for all facets of our society. It is economically a disaster, it affects the quality of our education, it increases insecurity in the streets, leading to an exodus from our cities, it expels Jews and gays and flushes decades of women's rights down the toilet." He has also characterized Eastern European immigrants as criminals and rapists. Any of this sounding familiar? Also similar is the seemingly contradictory stances on gender equality. In her 2015 study examining the 6 most electorally successful populist radical right parties in Europe, Tajitsky Ackerman described what she calls their Janus-facedness in terms of gender equality. The strongest articulation of gender equality is confined to discussions of immigration and integration. Parties are much more restrained and even outright antagonistic to gender equality and sexual rights outside of immigration policy. In the most moderated discussion, there is a recognition of modern gender roles and sexual identities as being part of a nation, but explicit opposition to any institutional establishment of rights are safeguards. So these parties tend to be against anti-discrimination policies, they tend to be against any positive or affirmative action policies, and they're pretty hostile to any discussion of marriage equality. Well, it might be easy to characterize these trends or dynamics as facets of right-wing hypocrisy, as is often done. They're not that far from the tendencies I found in my studies of the European Union and its efforts to address gender violence. Right, so this is my book in 2013, From Global to Grassroots. And this is an article that I published with Lisa Rollins and Augustin, a researcher at Vienna. And one of the things that we observed in then, which these came out in 2013, 2014, was there had already been a switch in 2000 following 9/11, which had repercussions that went well beyond US in terms of this shift in discourse. And more so that these had roots in much longer trajectories of racialized violence discourse. So what Lisa Rollins, Augustin, and I talked about in my book then as what we called the culturalization of gender violence discourse, I'm now much more explicit in describing it as the racialization of gender violence discourse, because that's exactly what it is. And this shift allows us to connect it to a much longer and endemic history of such discourses which have linked violence against women to these efforts to marginalize and oppress certain groups in a racialized way. So let me give you just a really brief overview about kind of where we're going with this talk. So I'm going to start with a theoretical discussion and framework of this trend, of what it means to racialize gender violence discourse and where it fits into kind of a larger historical perspective. Then I'm going to shift to the focus of the European Union, so kind of what the talk here more centrally is about today. I promise I'm going to get there. And so in that discussion, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview in terms of the history of gender violence in general, how it got on the agenda. The European Union isn't necessarily, when people think of it, they're not thinking about policies related to gender equality or even violence against women. So how did they get there? And then I'm going to present some of the research that I had done about policy discourse and how some of the changes and the shifts in the discourse have really had some substantial policy implications in terms of how the European Union and its member states have addressed gender violence within its countries. And then I'm going to kind of end with some lessons and considerations about kind of moving forward and kind of the need to resist the sort of co-option and the need for a more intersectional analysis of gender violence kind of from the beginning to the end. All right, so I'm going to talk about kind of some kind of basic, give you kind of just a little bit of an overview. I've written a lot lately that's been theorizing the racialization of gender violence discourse, and so I'm going to kind of stick to some of the big points about why it's a problem, what it's rooted in, and how it's a much longer history. So first of all, I want to start with that point that using gender violence to other groups is definitely not new. It has a really long colonial and imperialist history, and it's something that we see present today too. So you can go back hundreds of years to look at this kind of the threat of the raping of women and how it's been used to then justify different sorts of interventions. Characterizing Black and brown men in particularly as sexually violent, to use the language, often using the language of as savage or barbaric, has long been used to legitimate military action and occupation, or more recently and more insidiously to justify oppressive practices of surveillance and policing. These discourses are used, the discourses used are simultaneously raced and gendered, or what I often talk about in my research is race-gendered. And they're race-gendered both in how they characterize the men that are being characterized as a threat, but also in terms of how they're characterizing women as victims. In focusing on women as victims, there's a real high degree of paternalism that's going on, kind of the need to provide protection. And sometimes that paternalism is shown in talking not just about women, but women and children, right? So the need to protect women and children. The thing that varies in these discourses, both of which are paternalistic, are which women are then deemed as worthy of protection. And that's where you see some variance in terms of how the discourses emerge. Sometimes it's the women and children that are being othered, that are seen as being the target for protection. This is something that Spivak refers to as saving brown women from brown men, right? And so we see that this has been used even recently in the 2001 and the Gulf Wars to justify the invasion of Afghanistan, to the attacks on the Taliban, that justification of protecting the brown women. It's also, though, used in other ways to focus more explicitly on white femininity, where white women are the object of protection from these racialized groups. So these narratives, as I said, have a really long colonial history, and you could see that in terms of European colonization. You could see it in the colonization of the United States. You could see it in the colonization in Africa and other parts of the world, that this was that sort of justification about coming in, sending in the missionaries to civilize these uncivilized groups and to talk about this threat. And both of those discourses were used in that context, about kind of saving the poor, oppressed women who are oppressed under these, even though often the colonial policies that were put into place served to be repressive in terms of gender equality issues. It was used in talking about the Native Americans and that civilizing discourse that was a part of it. And it's something that you see that happened in slavery. It happened with the elimination of slavery in the Jim Crow era, that a lot of the lynching, a lot of the violence that was around lynching for Black men, but also Latinos in Texas and in parts of the Southwest, often had those discourses, that there was usually a charge that some white woman had been violated or had been threatened, and then there were very racialized and sexualized forms of violence that were then used in terms of doing that. Remnants of it today, too, in terms of the ways in which gender violence has been criminalized, which has been often a part of the feminist agenda. The earliest iterations of feminism were really resistant to that criminalization, because radical and socialist feminists saw the state as being a perpetrator of oppression and not necessarily a savior in that sense. And so the patriarchal conceptions of the state didn't see the state as being a possible solution for doing that. And part of it were women of color activists who were worried that the racial oppression of the state would then be enacted through these forms of violence, which was often the case. And so we still see that today in terms of the prosecution of sexual violence crimes, that who the victim is and her race gendered position is, and who the perpetrator are very relational. And as long as that violence upholds power hierarchies, it's less likely to be prosecuted. But whenever it goes against the power hierarchies, then those are the cases. And so that means that when we have a white man who's sexually assaulting a white woman, that sometimes that gets, but very often it's dismissed because there's a gender hierarchy within the race. But if you start to see that shift, and if it's a Black man, if it's a Latino, sexually assaulting a white woman, it's much more likely that that crime is going to be prosecuted. If the victim is a woman of color, those are hard to prosecute as well, right? And so some of these legacies in terms of who is deemed rapeable and who is worthy then of protection are things that we see all sorts of examples in the contemporary culture of these types of race-gendered analysis fitting in. So some of these framings, narratives really predate the articulation of gender violence as an issue of gender equality, our human rights. But since feminists succeeded in framing gender violence as a human rights issue and got it on the international agenda, something that was seen as a huge achievement, and something that LGBT groups were able to do a little bit later, albeit with more moderated success. Since that happened, there had already been efforts to co-opt that discourse and to characterize it in turn, to characterize human rights as core civilization values of Western nations exclusively. So this is one of the kind of the critiques that we hear in the human rights, is that how it's applied, who is seen as meeting human rights and who should be protecting the human rights and who are seen as the violators of human rights, that there has always been that sort of inequality, right, in terms of how Western nations have often kind of located human rights as something that belongs somewhere else, that these are the values of Western nations. We're not the violators of human rights. That's something that violation is happening elsewhere, even though that's clearly not been the case. And so as gender equality then gets included as that framing in human rights, some of that co-option that's happening of human rights is then getting co-opted within these discourses. So gender equality is a Western value and a hallmark of advancement, and countries who don't have those are somehow backwards, more barbaric and savage, so those terminologies. So this happens even though gender violence remains widespread in all of these countries, right? Part of the transnational mobilization getting gender violence on the international agenda was this universal argument that gender violence is something that crosses all borders. It happens in all countries. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic position. It doesn't matter your racial, ethnic position. It's something that that women in particular are vulnerable, and we're seeing those patterns happening all over the world. And so that had been the framing of it, but with the co-option, that's not exactly what's happening. So, which leads me to my second point, that this seemingly contradictory discourse articulated by the far right is actually consistent and widespread. In her work on Sally Engel Mary, she talks about how culture is often invoked as an explanation for gender oppression in a way that creates distinction between social groups and their relative desirability and undesirability. She discusses the problematic use of culture, whereby political elites, particularly those from the global north, often locate culture at the local and rural level, and not amongst themselves, but out there in the hinterlands, with the minorities. Well, here there is law, right? So that distinction is then getting used in a lot of these countries in that human rights discourse, with culture hiding from view, buried in the everyday practices of modernity. So as I was saying, so as there are these transnational feminists working to frame it as widespread, the co-option discourse tends to locate the violence as happening within particular groups, and to characterize certain forms of violence as being particularly egregious. For example, the disproportionate attention that's given in Europe to honor killings, to dowry death and female genital mutilation. Not that those aren't forms of violence that should be ignored, but they talk about it in a way as if those are somehow different and exceptional, and in a way that ends up normalizing the more widespread iterations of domestic violence and sexual assault, which are more widespread. And so some feminists have talked about the need to really characterize these forms of violence in context of it, right? How are honor killings and dowry deaths a part of domestic violence in a different iteration of it? And how can they be viewed in similar sorts of ways? Because some of the domestic violence that is being normalized has similar outcomes of death and mutilation in terms of its severity. And so this distancing, this locating gender violence is happening within particular groups and not within kind of the majority population, serves to absolve the majority group as being a perpetrator of violence, or it normalizes that violence, right? It talks about it as not being as bad, that we need to be focused on these other forms, on these other groups. And what this then does in terms of how these groups can then talk about the need to address gender violence at the same time that they're dismantling the policies aimed at combating that, is to say, okay, if the problem is not us, if the problem is this group, then the solution is to get rid of these groups, is to stop immigration, it's to oppress and surveil these groups. We don't need this gender equality policy because we've already achieved that, right? We're done with it, we don't need it. And so then that becomes a justification for dismantling all of the policies that have been adopted related to gender violence. So the racialization of gender violence discourse then has distinct as well as intersectional harms. It's a trend that hurts the groups that are being racialized, right? So it's hurting the groups that are being targeted as particularly violent, as being perpetrators, as being backwards, right? All of these terminologies that are often used in these racializing discourses, back to Trump, the savage, the barbaric. It's hurting the women at the intersection of race and gender, right? So it's hurting the women in these groups. And so even when there are those discourses that are talking about saving the brown women from this violence, part of their violence, part of their experience with violence is at the nexus of gender and race. And so when you're feeding into racialization, it's making it harder for these women to get help, right? So women of color in Europe and in the United States often have trouble getting help or escaping from violence because there's nowhere to go when those institutions are also raced, right? So when the criminal justice has institutionalized racism, with that calling for help from the police might result in not only a direct harm that they suffer at the hand of police, but sometimes an alienation of their community who sees that as bringing surveillance upon the community. And so that can become problematic, and it's something that you also see in terms of shelter services. If we have shelter services where staff has not been trained, or where there are other people that are seeking help from the shelters who then are perpetrating some of the intersectional harms, then that becomes a problem as well. So feeding into racialized trends makes it more precarious for women at the intersection of them. So it's actually feeding into the precarity that's a part of their violence. And so it's not making it any safer for them. And finally, because it's normalizing certain forms of violence and certain perpetrators of violence, then it's also hurting women and LGBTQ communities who now the forms of violence that they're experienced are now being dismissed and ignored in favor of focusing on, oh, well, let's just get rid of these groups. So it has these multiple harms for doing it. Now I want to stop here for a second, because usually I kind of get a little bit of like, okay, well then do we just need to go back to these universalizing discourses? Should we not be talking about race? Should we only be talking about gender and gender violence? And that's not the answer either, right, in terms of that. It's really important, you know, to make the distinction that racialization, the trends that I'm talking about, are distinct from acknowledging that race can be a contextualized factor for how violence is experienced, and that obstacles that marginalized groups face in seeking help, right? So you need to pay attention. There needs to be a racial analysis. And you need to pay attention to how different groups are experiencing violence, even when it is different forms of violence, but not in a way that is kind of pushing them and excluding them, but in a way that's including them, and making sure that when we do come up with efforts to combat gender violence, that we're doing it in a way that is making access more widespread, that is making it policy that's actually helping everybody and not having these unintentional or sometimes intentional harms that are doing that. And so one of the things Lisa Augustin, Rollinson Augustin and I talk about is there's a difference in terms of kind of diagnosing the problem, right, and focusing on, it's important to talk about gender violence in terms of that universal experience. It is widespread. We do find it across all of these barriers. But in terms of when we're coming up with a solution and trying to deem, like, what is the best way to come up with ways to help these different groups and pay attention to where we might need to know about their economic precarity or their racial precarity, that's when we're paying attention, right? It's paying attention to how different groups might be experiencing and what's the best way to get help for them. Because there are different considerations when you start bringing those different intersectional components in. All right. So there's my kind of theoretical overview in terms of kind of what has been guiding the research that I was doing and why it matters that this discourse is going in this direction. So let me talk about the European Union. So the European Union, and so for those of you who are European Union experts, this will be kind of like the quick and dirty overview of how the European Union works. And so one of the things that's really important to remember with the European Union is that it's a multi-level layer of governance. And there are multiple institutions, and within those institutions there are multiple actors. And so to say this is what the European Union does to deal with gender violence is really not an accurate sense, because there's a lot going on with different forces working in different sorts of directions. But there have been some important developments and evolutions that have been a part of the European Union process, as well as some of the troubling trends that I just kind of talked about within them. So in the European Union, right, so most people think about the European Union who don't know very much about it, think about it more in terms of like kind of a coordinated economic market, right, in terms of thinking about the economic component that it serves. And for a long time it was that way, and it still is one of its major foci in terms of doing it. But as it became the European Union, as it moved away from being just kind of an economic community or a series of treaties that were focused on trade and economic coordination, it's developed a citizenship component. It's developed a means of thinking about democratic institutions and rights. And so the treaties that were deemed kind of most important for thinking about gender equality were the Treaty on the European Union, which is the Maastricht Treaty, right? And so that's when you kind of start seeing it move from all of these kind of more economic components to talking about things like education, justice and home affairs, culture, cooperation, and development, right? So there's a shift in terms of that. And this is really when we start seeing kind of this competency related to gender equality start to develop. In the early years, gender equality got on the agenda, but it was more kind of almost by accident, where some countries were worried about, because they had gender equality policies in place, how might that place them in an unfair advantage in terms of competing, that it might make it harder for them to compete with other countries. But then it started, it was that opening up was something that transnational feminist groups were able to kind of mobilize and build upon. And so so in terms of that political opportunity structure, there's been kind of a cyclical pattern in which opportunities have opened, transnational networks have taken advantage of them, they've helped open up opportunities, and it's just kind of gone on in terms of those sorts of ways. And so the Maastricht Treaty was really important for that. The Amsterdam Treaty was also important for doing that. And so if Maastricht was kind of the starting point for really developing a competency in gender equality, the Treaty of Amsterdam was really the turning point. It improved the democratic nature of the European Union institutions, and it placed a greater emphasis on citizenship. And so of that, human rights and gender equality were listed as fundamental principles of it. And as I said, it kind of strengthened the institutions. I don't have the Nice Treaty on here, but the Nice Treaty was the enlargement treaty, and so it's not necessarily generally thought of as kind of expanding gender equality. But whereas a lot of the competencies for the European Union on gender equality are more soft law policy, especially gender violence, meaning that there's not a coercive element to it. It's a lot of like promoting norms and kind of placing soft pressure on states to change their policies and practices related to gender equality and gender violence. The enlargement process was probably the most coercive component that it had. And so that's where the European Union was able to kind of say, you need to change these things in order to be admitted to our union. And gender violence did actually come up in parts of the accession process, but not uniformly, and more in the later iterations than in the earlier iterations. And then the Lisbon Treaty, which includes the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is a more complete codification of human rights norms, is really the only place that gender violence is specifically mentioned. And so Lisbon in some ways opened up new opportunities that existed before, because before it was always this debate, should the European Union be involved in gender equality? And a lot of times that was debatable, right? It really depended on how gender violence was being framed. If it was being framed as an issue of gender equality and human rights, well, the European Union had some competencies in those areas. But if it wasn't being understood in that way, then it became a little bit more precarious in terms of whether it was seen as being it. And because even some of the issues of gender inequality and the competencies that were established in there were somewhat controversial and debatable, it meant that there was some unevenness in terms of the institutions and the actors within them in terms of whether or not they would promote issues of gender violence and how they would frame it. And so the framing of gender violence is really important to whether or not these institutions are paying attention, but so is the mobilization of the feminist advocates. And so within the European Union, the transnational networks that I'm talking about include kind of social movements that are outside at the national level and at the transnational level. But it also meant that there were femocrats, feminist advocates that were working within some of the institutions, and actors in various different components. And so these kind of networks included people within the European Union institutions as well as outside of them. In terms of the different institutions that I'm going to be talking about, just really briefly, there is the Commission. And the Commission is arguably the most important policymaking body, as it presents proposals for law and oversees the implementation of the European Union treaties and laws in member and candidate states, and it carries out common law policy. It has been fairly representative of women, at least more so than some of the states, some of the nation states that are a part of the European Union, not so much from the north, but from some in the southern and eastern European countries. Until more recently, issues of gender equality fell under their employment and social affairs, but violence was often dealt with under their justice and home affairs, and so it wasn't even located in the gender equality component. Now gender equality and violence fall under a new expanded portfolio of justice, fundamental rights, and citizenship. Leadership swings have been highly influential in terms of how gender violence was. There were some commissioners in the 90s that were more feminist in orientation that played a really huge role in getting the issue on the agenda and putting into place some really important programs. But since the 2000s, it's been more conservative commissioners that have been in charge of gender equality policy, and so that's mattered a lot in terms of how they framed it. The Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, under kind of the newer iterations of the treaty, are kind of co-legislators, but kind of with different components. The Council of Europe, it used to be the strongest, and now it's more on par with the Parliament. It represents the member states and is composed of various constellations of ministers. So the ministers that are in charge of the bureaucracies in the member states, depending on what issue is being debated, it's going to be different constellations of ministers. And so that means that the group that's dealing with gender violence, that can change from different other discussions that are going on, and that some of the trends that are happening in ideology and parties at the nation state trickle in to what's going on in the Council of Europe. Same thing is happening in the European Parliament, which is the most democratic. It was the institution who most consistently has dealt with gender violence, but for the long time it was the weakest institution. So where there was the most gender violence discourse going on was kind of the weakest institution. That shifted. A lot of the activism within the Parliament came from the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. And so they issued reports and a lot of soft law recommendations for dealing with violence. I'm not going to talk about the European Court of Justice, so it's already going a little bit long in terms of the presentation, so I want to kind of get to the meat of what some of these shifts have been. So one of the things just to kind of recognize in terms of that is the European Parliament, like I said, has been kind of the most consistently feminist, but it's been a group of actors within that. And as Europe has shifted to the right, kind of starting in the early 2000s, and especially after the economic crisis and the so-called refugee crisis, that has affected the composition of the Parliament, and including the committee that has most dealt with women's rights. It's affected the Council of Europe, and the European Commission has been pretty conservative for a long period of time. So in terms of some of the shifts that I saw within the discourse, in the 1980s, the 1980s, there was very little discourse within the European Union that talked about gender violence at all. And so to contextualize this, the national feminist movements dealing with gender violence were kind of in the 70s and the 80s. In the 1970s, it was more by radical and socialist feminists, so they were not looking for state solutions. They framed violence as being kind of an issue of gender and economic inequality. And so the only discussion that we see happens in the Parliament, and it's by that FEM Commission, that Committee on Women's Equality and Gender. And so they have a report and a resolution that they include during that time period. Their framing is actually pretty good in terms of how they address the issue. It keeps that sort of socialist feminist framing, talking about it as an issue of gender and socioeconomic inequality. It does talk about migrant workers, but it's talking about them in terms of their precarity, like in terms of how they're experiencing it. And so this is what it says about them. Some of it has some exclusionary tendencies, but most of it is focused on including them. Most of these women accept total subordination to the man, and even when they are ill-treated and beaten, often do not rebel. This is the part that's not so inclusive. Because in their isolated position, even a violent husband is a point of reference to which they cling. In the majority of cases, these women have no financial independence since they are housewives or have had unreliable and poorly paid jobs. And here they're connecting it to this discussion that they're talking about women, all European women, as having that. They're talking about it just being particularly egregious for migrant communities. The form of discrimination which leads to the ostracism of immigrant women are widespread and vary little from country to country. They stem from the ideas of women as subordinates, belonging to the lowest social strata, and as foreigners from the poorest countries with the different racial backgrounds. So here they're talking about the intersectional precarity. Right? Women and girls from minority groups are affected not only by the differences in social status between men and women in general and within their cultural groups, they are also penalized by the fact that they belong to a cultural minority. So this is the only framing we see. It's talking about that sort of positionality, but it's coming from, at that time, one of the weakest institutions in a very limited sort of way. In the 1990s, we see the world changing. We see the UN World Conferences, the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, the Beijing Women's Conference, talking about, and this is where transnational feminists are mobilizing and using the framing women's rights as human rights. And it's powerful. And it's something that the network within Europe is growing because they're preparing for these conferences. So they're coordinating, they're talking to each other, they're talking about what's going on in their countries. They're going to the conferences, they're talking to even more groups, and then they're coming back like empowered and mobilized and ready to make some changes. And so we start seeing a shift in a trickle within the institutions, still mostly in the parliament, a little bit in the commission and the council, because they're having to engage as members of the European Union. They're having to prepare reports at the country level, and so they're engaging in terms of it. This framing is primarily using that rhetoric of gender equality and human rights. The parliament, the most active, is the most feminist in terms of its adoption. The commission has a few documents. They're much more constrained in their attention, and they're more likely to talk about the human rights component and less likely to talk about the gender equality component. But the commission at the time has a really proactive kind of democratic socialist feminist from Sweden who also starts the Daphne program and STOP, which are two programs that end up funding a lot of transnational and domestic efforts to deal with gender violence. The council gives the least amount of attention to it, which at the time, kind of the council was one of the more influential members. They have some gender equality framing and less of a human rights one in terms of how they're addressing it. In the 2000s, we see all three institutions paying more attention to the issue of gender violence. But this is where we start to see some huge divergences, especially like it starts out kind of strong and a little bit more with the 1990s framings at the beginning of the 2000s. But after 9/11, we start seeing kind of that shift in the discourse, and we start seeing less attention to the universal nature of gender violence and more attention to specific forms of violence. That's where you start seeing the mentionings of honor killings and FGM in document after document. I'm using the language that they use rather than some of the language that's argued by other groups, feminist groups, about it. And so, you know, in this time period, then we start to see that the feminist framing, some of the remaining feminist framing, is lingering the most in the parliament, but it's often alongside these culturalized framings of gender violence. There's some in the council, and it's weakest in the commission. And it's the commission that, if it's mentioning gender violence at all, is almost exclusively talking about it in terms of these cultural forms of violence. And not only that, is they're starting to talk about it as kind of violence that's being brought to the European Union. So there's references in documents as well as in interviews about the importation of gender violence from other countries, and not something is like continuing the legacy that's already a part of it. So there's a 2005 FEM report that talks about the types of violence affecting women can vary according to cultural tradition, ethnic origin, or social background, whereas female genital mutilation, so-called crimes of honor and forced marriages, are now a reality in the European Union as well, right? So this kind of language here. One of a member of the council talks about how the fact that the European Union has been receiving immigration, well, it has made us confront much clearer, perhaps, issues like female genital mutilation, honor crimes, forced marriages, issues which we perhaps have overcome a little already, right? So it's kind of like, you know, they're bringing these problems, but we've already addressed gender equality issues, gender violence issues. The commission has some documents during this time period. Most of them, like I said, are really vague, and if they're making references, they're really narrow. They do, however, have a very comprehensive document that comes out on violence against women with all of the feminist framings about human rights and equality. the most elaborate document. It has all these specific recommendations, but it's not aimed at the member states. It's aimed at European member states in terms of their foreign policy to other countries, right? And so there's a clear adoption of the feminist rhetoric, but it's talking about, well, when you're dealing with these other countries where gender violence is a problem, these are the things that you need to take into consideration. And so it stands in stark contrast to their roadmap for equality for what to do within the gender states. So the fact that the Commission in particular is taking this really conservative and kind of co-opted approach to gender equality, these really narrow sorts of framings, has really important implications because, as I mentioned, the Commission in many ways is the most influential member. It's the one that's really implementing all of these policies and supporting the programming. And so while I won't have a lot of time here to kind of talk about all of the ways in which this has had these really explicit, I'll just give a brief overview to what I found in my research, but then also as I was preparing for this talk, I kind of did a quick overview to see how much the discourse had changed in the last few years. So one of the things was that I saw some of these disparities in terms of how the Commission wasn't really addressing these issues in terms of domestic policies for the existing member states. But in the accession process, there were some shifts. And in the earlier waves of accession, as it was incorporating countries that were a little bit closer, that had more perceived common histories, places like Poland and Hungary, it very rarely ever mentioned anything about gender violence. But as it's moved further east, its attention to gender violence abuses has increased. And that doesn't match up perfectly with whether or not those abuses actually exist. So for example, and one explanation could be, well, part of that is the European Union has gotten more specific about these recommendations. So of course it's going to have more standards for the most recent ones. But Turkey consistently was the one country through all of the waves of accession that was getting attention, and even that language, that same sort of language of that kind of the barbaric practices that are happening. Even though there were some really egregious cases of domestic violence that were being found in some of the other Central European countries at the time period, and that there were very homophobic, very misogynistic practices that were very much in play. So you kind of see that in the accession process. Daphne, which was, I would argue, one of the most important programs that the European Union had for supporting and developing the capacity of nations to address gender violence, not only at the local level for states that didn't have the funding or the political will to address the issue, but also in terms of facilitating transnational cooperation, which has really opened opportunities. At the same time, they're ramping up this discourse on culturalized forms. They're like cutting back on Daphne and watering it down. So the most successful policy they have is on the chopping block, continually having to be defended. At the same time, there's this articulation of discourses. The European Institute for Gender Equality was just kind of coming into, getting started when I was finishing my research. I took a look at kind of there still are funding that's available to deal with gender violence, and the European Institute for Gender Equality is really great in terms of data collection. It's really pushed. One of the biggest challenges in dealing with gender violence is there's not good data on it, right? Some of the indicators, just because a country has high rates of gender violence doesn't mean that it's worse there. It means that maybe people are reporting it and there's better data collection that's going on, and so they've worked a lot in terms of that. But in all of the sites that I saw gender violence being mentioned across the European Union, inevitably, any discussion of gender violence had a discussion of female genital mutilation, like as a part of it, as something that was being prioritized. And so there's still this tying together of these culturalized forms of violence, and less of a discussion about how widespread it is, an ongoing part of the discussion, and the opportunities for addressing it that were kind of existent earlier in the 90s have slowly been diminished and watered down. And so some of the funding opportunities to deal with gender violence are kind of alongside broader issues of violence among youth, so not the gendered component, and sometimes along with like drug and alcohol abuse. And so the ways in which they're framing it is kind of pulling away from that gender equality framing for it. So where does this leave us in terms of it? Well, a big part of the research that I've been doing, not only in Europe, in the United States, but more globally, is about how intersectionality really is an imperative in terms of effectively addressing gender violence and making sure that it actually is something that's that's being more effectively eradicated and addressed, right? You need to understand the ways in which gender violence is not only gendered, but raced and classed, how all sorts of different inequalities are a component of that gender violence, but also to resist this co-option, right? This co-option that's being used in a way that doesn't make anyone safer, and in fact is introducing more forms of oppression within that. It's important to bring this intersectional analysis into the policy analysis itself in terms of how it's framed, how it's implemented, right? To talk about how these different components feed into it. But it's also really important in terms of the advocacy and the mobilization, right? It's really easy to put all of the blame on far-right parties, on populist parties, on conservative groups that have kind of taken this co-option. But a lot of times their discourse is overlapping with groups that would characterize themselves as feminist, as progressive, as anti-oppression. And that co-option allows is because there is that gray space, because that there is those discourses happening within feminist movements, in which there's kind of this tendency to have this sort of hegemonic feminism, white feminism or Western feminism, in which it's easy to fall into that sort of saying like, well, you know, it's particularly bad in these sorts of ways, and not to stand in terms of solidarity. And the more intersectional analysis of gender violence really shows the room for solidarity there is within the feminist movement today. That a movement like the Women's March, and this is the Women's March that was in the UK, and if you looked at that Women's March, it wasn't just signs about gender equality. There's like a Black Lives Matter sign in there, there's signs about immigration, there's signs about economic inequality, and people talked about how, well, it was a march about everything. Well, it was still a march that was about gender equality, and it was still a march that was addressing gender violence. But all of those movements fit within that, right? If there is a commitment to the feminist message of, you know, violence is a problem that affects, you know, it crosses all borders, then we need to pay attention to those borders and make sure that all of those groups are being included in the efforts to combat it, and that these exclusionary approaches are not being taken. And there's a reason to do that. There's a reason to kind of, because women are overlapping within this group. There are all these different groups that are represented in this universal category of women that are experiencing violence. But also because we see how it can work then to hurt not only women at the intersection of these different marginalities, but it actually works at hurting all women and all sexual and gender minorities when that co-option happens. All right. I think I will end there.